our next presenter wears many hats. He is a Gingin cattle farmer, an agricultural consultant with decades of experience, and apparently we have him to thank for the prevalence of perennial pastures and crop grazing in WA. So it's Phil Barrett-Lennard. He specialises in pastures, livestock and mixed farming systems, conducting research and consulting. He's here to talk to us about the management strategies to reduce the summer-autumn feeding gap from a profit point of view. Please help me welcome Phil.
Thank you, Georgia. A topic that comes after the event, so you have to look forward to thinking about how you're going to handle it next year. So I think the topic of the autumn feed gap, it's a pretty critical one for the vast majority of Western Australia. When you go around and ask farmers when's the toughest period, when's your feed gaps, everyone says autumn, and occasionally someone will mention another one at some time, which, depending on your system, it could be late spring, it could be over summer. So the autumn feed gap's where it's at in terms of it's a crucial limitation to our livestock systems in WA. So I've sort of tried to describe our production system graphically and very simply in this graph, and it'll come up a number of times in the talk. So the green line is our pasture production curve and starts sometime in autumn, hopefully. Sometimes it might not start till June in a late break. And pasture growth builds through the season and peaks in spring and then rapidly declines into summer. That's actually real data from somewhere like Narrogin, I think it was, long-term average of pasture growth rates per month. So I didn't just make that one up, but I did make some of the other lines up. Obviously that's the green feed side of it, and then when the summer hits we have the dry side. So I just put this line in here that slides down gently down until we hit autumn, early winter, when all that dry feed either has been eaten or has rotted away. So these lines are obviously, every season is completely different, and each set of lines is going to be different. But this, I suppose what I'm representing could be someone's average scenario. The blue line is animal demand, and it's never flat, and every person's animal demand line is completely different. So rather than try to guess one, I just thought, well, we'll just put one in there. So really what the autumn feed gap is, this gap. So as the dry feed runs out, or the summer autumn feed runs out, the winter spring feed kicks up, but it's the gap in between livestock demands here. So today I'm going to sort of break the talk down into things we can do to shift this line out a bit, so that we're chipping off a bit of the red there. Things we can do to drop this blue line, and things we can do to increase that green line. So we're sort of trying to chip away at that red. Because you've got to remember that might be an average year, but when we have a late break, this green line goes way down here and that red area gets way bigger. And when we have a drought year, we don't have much carryover from here. So this yellow line comes down here and the red gets bigger this way. So, yeah, we're just trying to work out how we can shift these different elements. The thing about the blue line is that obviously we can drop this blue line through having a lower stocking rate, but you can only do that so much because stocking rate drives profit. We've got to be able to utilise as much of this as we can. So we've got a bit less to do there than we do on some of these other areas. Otherwise, we just run ourselves into a very lowly profitable system. So we'll start with the yellow line. What can we do to move that out and help fill in a bit of this gap through here? So one of the more obvious ways is just by growing more pasture in the spring. So this here ends up higher, therefore that yellow line comes down, further into summer and autumn. I think one of the biggest challenges we've had to better spring pastures, particularly in the last decade or so, is the string of bad years we've had, and sometimes we've had them 2 in a row. And that's really hurt our pasture density. And I think there's probably been, in some ways, a bit of a lack of pasture reseeding as well. People have taken their eye off the ball of that. So, yeah, I think anything we can do to improve our winter and spring pastures definitely can have a flow-over effect into summer and getting through autumn. For those that are in the mixed farming game, one of the really key players is how much stubble you have. And so a system with more crops and less livestock has a much bigger amount of dry feed. So essentially, if you don't have any stubbles, your dry feed starts here and goes down. But if you suddenly go harvesting, this yellow line starts way up here. You've got this whole extra big bucket load of stubbles that you can utilise. So for some people that have traditionally been in a medium rainfall or higher rainfall zone that are slowly increasing their cropping percentage, it generally makes their summer-autumn management a lot easier. Granted, stubbles perhaps aren't exactly what they used to be, but it can make a big difference. And I'll just go through these other ones in some slides now. So chaff heaps. So when we're harvesting our crop paddocks and we're putting all the residue, the grain and the fine material, the chaff, and into a chaff cart and then dumping it. So Ed Rigor has done some really good work, partly through PDS projects, looking at the value of these to sheep relative to traditionally managed crop stubbles. And there was definitely an advantage to having that feed concentrated in the one spot, so they don't have to go searching around. And there's also a degree of weather repellents having them in stacks like that. So I think there are a number of different ways that cropping or croppers are dealing with weeds in their crops. And I think if you're a livestock person, the chaff cart is the way to go. I think if you're looking at a mill where you grind up the seeds, then obviously you're losing a lot of stock value there. And I think these are definitely better than the chaff lining method. So I think the chaff piles are an excellent way for a mixed farmer to increase that summer-autumn feed. Obviously, a traditional way that we've managed summer-autumn feed in the mixed farming zone is growing standing fodder crops. So in this case, it's an oat crop that was grown as if it was for harvest, but then left unharvested, and weaner sheep go on that, often supplemented by lupins. Great way of taking spring feed out and pushing it into summer and autumn. Great thing about this is you've got the grain component, which is high quality, and typically when you're using oats, you supplement with lupins to build up some extra protein and energy, particularly for these lambs. But I do know a few people that are growing lupin standing fodder crops, which is a bit novel, but they've seen excellent lamb growth rates. Don't see this system working quite as well for cattle. You just get too much wastage, but it works to some degree. The other advantage of this standing fodder crop is that it can be undersown with some clovers or ryegrass, and then you have an exceptionally productive pasture the following year. For the cattle people, this is something that I do on my farm at Gingin, is what I call swath grazing. So we cut a paddock that can be pasture, it could be a crop. We cut it at hay time and then we windrow it and put it into swaths. It's something that producers in Canada and parts of North America do. And then using that through the summer and into autumn. And what happens with this system is that obviously summer rain can be detrimental. But then we have years where we have no summer rain at all, and that feed value of that's the same as hay. But with the swath being reasonably big, they do shed some water, and even in a wet summer, the feed value is reasonable. It's not great, but it's reasonable. So that's another way where we can shift feed out of the spring and into the summer and the autumn. Onto some of the perennial options. Georgia said, I've got a real interest in perennial pastures, done a lot of work in this space. So one of the plants that really help in WA are the fodder shrubs. So saltbush, an obvious example, but we also have Tagasasti for completely different parts of the landscape. There's big swags. I drive around the wet belt a bit, and there's big swags of land that can still go to saltbush. You can carry that feed right through until the break of the season. It's turning relatively unproductive land into something highly productive. We've just got to remember with fodder shrubs is that they often have some nutritional issues attached to them. So saltbush is very high in salt. So we need to dilute the salt down by having really clean, fresh drinking water, but we also need to add other feed types with it. So either it's stubbles and adjoining paddocks or straw or hay or grain, we can't just rely on saltbush as a sole diet. It really needs to be probably a third of the diet or less. But yeah, farms that have done significant plantings of saltbush generally see a vast improvement in how they manage that autumn feed gap. Perennial pastures. So this is actually on my farm at Gingin. This was taken, I think I looked up, was the 8th of March this year. So we'd had 2 summer rain events, one in early February and one in early March. So this is a subtropical perennial pasture, mostly Gatton Panic and a little bit of Rhodes grass. So they are extremely, as you can see, extremely responsive to summer rain when it's warm, coming from Africa and via Queensland. So the thing with these pastures is that they can really help with that summer-autumn feed gap, but they are a lot less reliable at doing it than, say, saltbush. They tend to be quite explosive after a rain event, and if we have a very long, hot, dry summer, they don't do a lot of growing. So useful to have in the system, but you've got to be mindful that they aren't going to fill it reliably every year. Thankfully, in my situation, we've had 2 summers with similar rainfall events where we've had 1 February rain and 1 March rain. And that's allowed us to get some really handy grazing in March and April. Lucerne. So this is, they talk about lucerne being the queen of foragers, and this is Marcus saunus, the king of lucerne in WA, down at the north side of the Stirling Ranges. So, there's different types of perennials. There's a whole swag of different ones. It's just about finding the niche, which soil type, which climate. Marcus has great experience with lucerne, and again, this was taken this year after some summer rain. So, but there are other perennials as well. We'll touch on one in Zach's talk next. And then we've got more of the summer fodder crop, things like millet and sorghum and Sudan. And they are even more variable or more risky, I suppose, than the perennial grasses, because you've got to sow them and you might not get any rain after sowing. So I think if you polled anyone in WA that has sown these types of things, there'll be probably a lot of frustration and the occasional euphoria, because when they work really well, but because of the climate we have and the unreliability of summer rain, they can be very disappointing. I think there'll be quite a bit of this stuff sown this year, because we've got a lot of paddocks on the south coast that are underwater, and basically the crops have died. So there'll be people putting these things in because really they haven't got anything else. But this particular example is Simon Woolwork at Corrigan, and he's incorporated it into his crop rotation by fallowing the paddock in winter, moldboarding it to reduce the water repellents, and then sowing it early in the spring. And he sort of de-risked it to a degree. He tends to then get quite reliable early summer production, because he's got that fallow of profile of moisture, and then the sort of upside comes with any summer rain. So yeah, they are definitely riskier than the other options we've discussed so far. Okay, so that's the sort of autumn supply options. Then let's talk about the blue line, so autumn demand. What can we do to this line here? So obviously one way that we can take that number down is by reducing our breeding herd numbers and having a trading component to our business. And Ashley Herbert will give a bit of a talk about some of those options in his talk later on. Not for everyone, but certainly can be very useful at dropping this blue line, either right down to the bottom if you're 100% trading, or just down a little bit if you're doing some trading. Probably the key way that we have in WA of reducing this blue line in the autumn is by moving our calving and lambing dates into winter. And a lot of people have done that, and a lot of people have had great success, but we still have huge numbers of people, particularly in the cattle industry, but also in the sheep industry, that are calving right smack bang in the middle of this autumn feed gap. I don't know what we can do, but we've got to get them out of there and into here. It's just hard yakka. Lambing and calving during the feed gap. Take for example just a single bearing ewe. Her demand doubles at least during lactation compared to when she's dry. So that makes a massive impact here. Obviously, stock sales is something we can tweak, trying to get rid of animals before the autumn break, just managing the timing of that, keeping them growing, having them presentable. And the other thing is about having animals, using the animals to transfer the energy. So you're not transferring the pasture from spring through to autumn, you're transferring the energy in the pastures. So the haystack on the back refers to fat on the back of the animal, condition score essentially. So, if we can utilise, we're always, in the vast majority of years, we're going to have surplus feed in spring. And so ideally we want animals that can pile on some fat and then they can utilise it later on here. The interesting thing is that Murdoch Uni has got a research project in this area at the moment, and I think I read the other day they said that animals, I think it was with half a condition score more, had 10% lower maintenance energy costs. So that's a handy thing. That's not even drawing down on the haystack. That's just at a plateau. So I think there's a couple of mechanisms that we can further tweak. Some of it's genetic and some of it's management. Now, obviously, we're always going to have this. It's very hard not to have a red hole, the gap. We can do, chip away, like I'm saying, at the yellow lines and the blue lines and the green lines. But we're always going to some degree have this red hole. So what are we going to fill it with? I think for a lot of people, grain is still going to be the cheapest and easiest, especially for those in the sheep industry. Cereals and lupins. We're very blessed with lupins in Western Australia. Harder to feed grain to cattle, so hay tends to do a fair bit of the hard work in the cattle industry. Some of that's pretty poor quality, and some of it's wasted, so we can probably improve that. Silage, I think, is an area that will expand, and I'll touch on that in a minute, partly to do with efficiencies and partly to do with feed quality. And obviously in the cropping business, we can utilise some straw, baled up straw, and also baled up chaff heaps are proving really useful, particularly when used in confinement feeding. In terms of that silage, I'm really interested in the fit for whole crop cereal silage, and cereal or cereal plus a legume. So it might be vetch, for example. So I think what's happened is that, in Western Australia, we've got particularly good now at growing crops, sometimes on relatively low amounts of rainfall. We've got big, open, flat country, pretty easy to travel. And I think we can easily harvest and store whole crop cereal silage. The challenges will be in feeding it out. And so I think it'll suit enterprises that are larger in scale. The issue with just straight cereal silage is that protein can be a little limiting. It's not the greatest. So that's where either adding a legume or combining it in a mixed ration, perhaps with some lupins. But we can get some pretty large tonnes of dry matter per hectare out of this system. So it'll be interesting to see where that sort of goes over the next decade. I just think it's part of the efficiencies, and we can harvest a lot of material in a short amount of time. Now, the green line. So the green line, how can we shift this green line so that we aren't supplementing right through winter, which sometimes we do. So I'll just go through these sort of options. Confinement feeding, which is really deferral, that's what we're talking about there. And then a number of other options. So we'll just run through these. And so I think I'll briefly touch on it here. With confinement feeding, the thing that we're doing with confinement feeding is that we might actually have to extend this red box a bit along the bottom here because we're sort of delaying by deferring. But then what happens is that green line quickly overcomes the blue line so that we don't have this sort of tapering off. That's very much a non-deferred situation where we're feeding, and the pastures are slowly growing, and then they finally get above maintenance or demand. Whereas with deferral, we're probably going to put a bit more energy earlier on into feeding, and then we're going to quickly shut it off because we've got much better pastures. So, yeah, I think with the types of seasons we've had recently, not so much this year, but for some people this year, but particularly 2019 and 20, we've particularly tough autumns and early winters, and confinement feeding really stood out. for getting stock off pastures, reducing their demands from not having to roam around looking for feed, and also allowing those pastures to get going. Really, really big impact, I think, on businesses, and then allowing them to run a much higher stocking rate than they've traditionally done. Now, in terms of pasture options, I think this is some data that someone gave me, and it's really fascinating, and I've called it Foo Ain't Foo. So it's about plant architecture. So the orange bars are the amount of foo you need to achieve weight gain, and the blue bars are days before weight gain occurs. So this is after the break of the season. So we know erodium is an extremely flat, low-growing plant. So you need a foo of at least 625 before you get growth, and it takes 100 days after the break. So that's over 3 months. We know subclover is quite a prostrate plant, so that's a little better, but not much. Silvergrass is not a great plant, and you can see its numbers aren't great. Capeweed is a little bit more upright. So that's foo begins at, live weight gain starts at 360 kilos of foo and 58 days since the break. I'm not sure, this might have been a late break because they're quite long numbers, those. But the thing that's really interesting is look at ryegrass, annual ryegrass. You only need 200 of foo to start achieving live weight gain, and it's only 18 days from the break because it's just so upright. So Ed and I and some other people have been doing some work on cereals, and we think cereals sit even better than ryegrass. Don't know the exact numbers, but I reckon it's probably somewhere between 100 and 200 of foo is all you need to start achieving live weight gain, which seems staggering. And it's probably, something like 15 or 18 days. So, if you contrast those numbers with some of these numbers, when you're having a tough winter, it really does matter what type of plant you have in the paddock. So here's a trial that I ran at Wailabing, I think it was 5 years ago. So this was I think it was about the 8th or 10th of May sown barley crop. And this photo was taken on the 1st of June. And the crop was at the 2.5 leaf stage. So it was only, 2 or 3 weeks old. And that is what 77 kilos of food looks like in a barley crop. And you go, yeah, there's not much there. But we stuck 1 pregnant ewe to the hectare in that paddock. And 3 weeks later, it looked like that. So just so you know, this is the exclusion area, fenced it off, and this is where they grazed. So you can see there's a little bit more grazing here than here. So that's all well and good. But here's the data. So what we did was we put half the mob on crop and half the crop went on a pasture, which wasn't the greatest pasture, but it certainly wasn't the worst. It had some subclover, it had some ryegrass, it definitely had a bit of silvergrass, it definitely had a bit of capeweed. So they were pregnant, twin-bearing merino ewes in the last month of pregnancy. They were due to lamb on the 1st of July. So you can see the ones on pasture, they pretty much maintain condition. The ones on the crop, even though they went in on a starting foo of 77 kilos, which does sound like an animal welfare issue, they then, over those 3 weeks, lifted in condition score from 3.1 to 3.4. And you think, wow, that's pretty amazing. So it's about plant architecture, very erect plants, but partly it's about feed quality. Look at the feed quality of the barley crop, 12 to 14 megajoules of energy and just protein in excess, really, compared to the pasture, which was quite a good pasture and still wasn't super high energy. So I think cereals are, in terms of getting out of the blocks fast and trying to help overcome that back end of the autumn feed gap, really, really handy. The other thing that we've lost a bit in recent years is pasture density. Partly that's because more cropping, and partly that's due, I think, to seasonal factors, perhaps partly, again, due to a lack of reseeding. So this is just some really old data that I picked up somewhere. So it's just about plants per square metre on the bottom axis and foo on this axis. So you can see there's just a straight line relationship between the denser the pastures are and the more pasture you grow. So if we can have dense pastures, we'll get up to those foos and get over the autumn feed gap quicker. So grassy pastures. If we're not in a cropping situation, how can we have grassier pastures, particularly at the beginning of the year? We still want clover, obviously, or a legume, but it's nice to have grassy pastures because of that upright architecture. So they are nitrogen responsive, which is another tool that we can throw at it. But I guess how do we create them? So the dairy industry obviously relies a lot on seeding late maturing ryegrass, and we're starting to see sheep and beef people do a lot more of that as well. If you're a mixed farmer, you might have some weedy paddocks in your cropping situation, so they can come out. You might just have some longer term grassy pastures that might, still have some legume but are a bit more grass dominant. The issue there might be in how do you manage that and how do you manage the good grasses from the bad pastures. Or, as we're seeing in the wheat belt, some people say, I'm not going to have any ryegrass because I have a zero tolerance in my cropping system. I'm just going to use cereals for my erect early feed. And then the only thing that stumbling block in that system is potentially feed quality in spring. So then we've got to think about, well, what can we mix with that cereal? Can it be a legume? Could it be vetch? Can it be something that's a bit longer and better quality at the back end? Because we don't want to just concentrate on one part of the season and completely forget about the back end. We just talked about nitrogen. So obviously a dense grassy pasture or a cereal will respond to nitrogen. And, some real rough rules of thumb might be 10 kilos. 10 kilos of food per unit of N in the winter and 20 in the spring. So at $6.50, which urea price is above that now, but it comes and goes, $140 a tonne is certainly cheaper than most supplements. So in spring, when we don't often need the feed, we can produce dry matter quite cheaply from nitrogen because we get such a good response rate. Definitely worth thinking about nitrogen if we're trying to get through that feed gap. Now, one of the things that I'm really passionate about is I drive around and I see way too many, particularly sheep paddocks, but I see way too many pastures sitting at around 500 kilos of food in the middle of winter. I really get annoyed about it. Because essentially I see pasture growth as it's sort of like a 3-speed, 3 gears in the car. It's an old-fashioned car. So we've got first gear, which is around this sort of 500 of food. And this is an old graph out of the Prograves manual. So we've got feed on offer and we have energy intake by an animal. And so this is vegetative. So this is our winter pasture, high quality. So you can see even at 500 kilos of food, we're only getting 6 or 8 megajoules of energy intake. It's not enough. The animals are going backwards in a hurry. So we really want to have our pastures in gears 2 or 3. So at least 1,000 kilos of food, and particularly for twin bearing ewes, 1,500 kilos or above. So we need to get our pastures into gears 2 and 3. My way of thinking is gear 1 is not actually somewhere where animals go. Gear 1 is just a pasture gear, so that the pastures have to get to there before they get to gears 2 and 3. And so this is what deferral is all about, is getting our pastures from 0 up to 1,000 kilos of dry matter as quickly as possible. And when I see animals on pastures of 500 kilos of food, they're going to stay there for ages because once they're on it, the growth rates decline. You're just stunting the plant. So, my ambition is we get more people up in gears 2 and 3 as quick as possible after the break of the season. And the thing that we're probably a bit weak on is having these third gear pastures for twin bearing ewes. I think we've got the sheep industry has got quite good at scanning singles and twins and running them separately, but I don't think we're running our twin bearing ewes as well as we could be. And I think part of the answer is the gear 3 pastures. I sometimes run workshops for wheat belt NRM, and one of the little things we do is we map out our feed resources. So in our sort of basic mixed farming system or just a standard farming system, we have our annual pasture, green in the end of autumn, winter and spring, and then we're relying on stubbles or dry feed in summer. And what I encourage people to do is to diversify that system to make it more robust. And so we introduced a lot of these different elements that I've discussed so far. So fodder shrubs for April and May, confinement feeding in May, crop grazing in June, a standing fodder crop in November, December and January for weaned lambs. Once you do that, you start breaking apart, you've partly filled the autumn feed gap, but you've been able to get animals off stubbles earlier, and then you can get into seeding and protect those soils, and you've also been able to defer the annual pastures. And then what happens when we have a late break? Well, probably the easiest thing is just to put an extra month into confinement feeding and then delay our crop grazing a bit. So the system's still quite robust. We've just got to be a bit flexible in how we apply it. Some take-home messages. So overcoming the challenges, the summer-autumn feed gap is critical to achieving high levels of livestock profitability. So that's a no-brainer. We've got to get through. We've got to get enough animals through to make money when we do have grass. And that's just about managing those different elements, the yellow line, the green line, the blue line. And in terms of, so this sort of feed budgeting stuff, there's a lot of resources out there, and these are just some. So MLA has a feed demand calculator, very easy to find on their website. Lifetime Ewe Management is an excellent course and has some great resources on this. Bred Well, Fed Well, Dave talked about it. More beef from pastures, making more from sheep, they're both on the internet. So if you want to get down into some detail, they are the resources. And that's me. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. That was fantastic. Have we got some questions from the floor? Got one just there.
Nice work, Phil. I liked your presentation. I really do feel your pain on that, looking at those pastures that are about 500 kilograms dry matter per hectare through winter. So why do you think that is? Why do you constantly see that?
Well, I suppose it's partly a bit of a hangover, I think. It's a hangover from good seasons. So, as we've gone through a drying trend since 2000, I don't think we've reacted quickly enough. We've just almost expected pasture growth to be better than it is. I think also in the sheep industry, it has a little bit of a hangover from the wool dominance era, where we used to run sheep a lot harder. And now we've got a system where we've got livestock sales and lamb sales are a more important part of it. And so they do respond to the increasing levels of food as well. I don't know, maybe I need a degree in psychology as well, because it's a human issue as much as anything. Yeah.
Phil, for the growers south of Perth that haven't grown summer fodder crops before, have you got any sort of recommendations for this season, given the amount of subsoil moisture that's going to be around? Any varieties?
I think from what I've seen, I'm not greatly experienced in the summer fodder crop area, but I do know that the millets are very safe, but they're not as drought tolerant. The sort of sorghums are the other way around. They're less safe because of prussic acid, but they're definitely more drought tolerant. So there's probably been a bit more of a niche for the Sudan grasses, which are a bit safer and probably in between, or getting towards sorghum for drought tolerance. They do vary in germination temperature requirements, so do a bit of research on that. So there are some differences between the different ones. Some of them will need 15 degrees soil temperature to germinate, some will need 18. So that is important, because as we're going through spring, we can run out of moisture before we get the right temperature. That's probably in a nutshell. Yeah, what I have to say. Do some research for sure.
We're dominating. So we're from UWA. So we have been funded in the past by MLA to do some work on native forage shrubs. And you brushed on shrubs in your presentation, but we didn't dwell into that too much. So one of the outcomes from those projects was that supplementing with forage shrubs, you get similar or if not better animal productivity if you grow them on marginal land. So this was a whole farm modeling. So I don't know if that ever... So what are the other limitations of using shrubs? I don't see much of that happening. Or do you know if producers are uptaking this or...
Other limitations? Yeah, so I think probably with saltbush, the biggest limitation is the establishment cost. So they are expensive to establish, and it is quite a manual task. So I think that's what holds people back. And then it's just about getting the management right. But that's not too difficult. Yeah, so I would say establishment costs for sure, and then the long return on investment. Because, so for example, Annamieka saltbush, so the latest release of saltbush, the best saltbush we have in terms of feed quality, I think it's 75 or 80 cents per stem. So that soon starts adding up when you put them in. Yep.
Phil, great presentation on a very important topic. Thank you. Just wanted to flag that there is a national project which is co-funded by AWI, MLA, GRDC and Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment called the Dryland Pasture Legumes Project. It's investigating the capacity of hard-seeded annual legumes to increase feed supply on mixed farms in acidic and alkaline soils in medium to low rainfall areas through summer sowing and development of new pasture legume species, which is really exciting. So this may be a future opportunity for producers to increase their options for filling that autumn feed gap. Do you see any other opportunities out there, such as the novel legumes, which producers might be able to utilise?
Yeah, I think that work, and I'm quite familiar with some of that work. So there's been some really interesting experiments where they've compared the summer sowing, and let's just use French Ceradella, for example. So they've either summer sowed it, so put pot in the ground in February or March, or compared it to where they've done a knockdown spray and then seeded seed of the same plant in, say, May, and the dry matter difference in June was unbelievable. It was like 10 factor more by sowing it early and getting little bits and pieces of autumn rain, often not huge amounts. But things like Ceradella, it can be slow in the winter, but it's particularly slow when it germinates late. So if you can get it germinate early and develop a root system and develop some leaf area, then come June, it can be quite impressive. So, no, definitely, I have actually touched on that in previous longer talks when I've had a bit more time, because that is an option. And I think in parts of the wheat belt, vetch is people are looking more seriously at vetch. It's a bigger seed, it can be sown deeper, it's got quite good early vigour. So I think that's another, in terms of the legume options, I think that definitely some of the options. And I suppose it's about finding the right species for the right environment and the right management. Bicerula is a pasture that is very persistent and very hard seeded, but it has some issues around photosensitivity, but it's also quite drought tolerant, and so can germinate in autumn and stay, not die. Whereas we're quite used to our legumes, particularly with subclover, getting the big autumn rain and then no rain, and it's the false break. So I think that's partly what contributes sometimes to our false breaks when we get an autumn rain, but we get a false break. So having legumes that either can handle a false break or management that gets around that somehow. Yeah.
We've got time for one more question if anyone else had one. There was a hand up here earlier. Oh. And just while the microphone is coming across, correct me if I'm wrong, Ellie, but that is running across the state at the moment. So if anyone wants to chat to Ellie about that project, she'll be standing at her stand by your tea and coffee.
Yeah, great presentation, Philip. There's a huge range of options there. Just wondered if you might expand a wee bit more on, you spoke about it, deferment grazing, but, intensive rotational grazing and the use of temporary electric fencing to achieve your option.
Yep. So, in terms of rotational grazing, the dairy industry clearly believes in it. They just do it routinely. And so we know that rotational grazing, particularly on a ryegrass pasture, does give an increase in winter feed, no doubt. So probably for dairy people and for cattle people, I think it's a bit of a no-brainer to be doing rotational grazing through the winter. I think in the sheep industry, it's a little trickier. Bigger paddocks, often in the wheat belt, lambing. So I've sort of probably gone off rotational grazing definitely as a key part of the sheep system. I just think it's an optional extra occasionally. I think the key thing for the sheep industry is the deferment and about having the productive pastures early. So having the cereals or the things that are going to give quick feed, but have them deferred, and having probably the confinement feeding is the crucial part of that for the sheep side of it. So it's sort of winter lambing, so you can confine through the late autumn and early winter, and then having those erect productive species, I think, is a bit more of an important thing than. Whereas I think in dairy and beef, with particularly in the high rainfall zone where we've got annual ryegrass, which really responds to rotational grazing. Yeah. So, in the sheep system, we can do rotational grazing probably around at other times, but I don't see it so much in the winter.